So our fourth session of the day will be by David Drake. David is Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Extension Wildlife Specialist with the University of Wisconsin. Drake co-authored the article from the Wildlife Society Bulletin, Regulated Commercial Harvest to Manage Overabundant White-Tailed Deer, an Idea to Consider. New York State DEC biologists rely upon recreational hunters to control deer numbers. As the average age of hunters increases, currently about 51 years old in New York State, and fewer are hunting in some locations, some wonder if numbers can be controlled by recreational hunting alone. David Drake will introduce the idea of legalizing the sale of venison as an incentive to harvest deer.
So if you're a deer hunter, and especially if you're a passionate deer hunter, if you find yourself getting emotional about what I'm talking about, or you feel your blood pressure rising, instead of thinking about commercial regulated harvest of deer, think about the commercial regulated harvest of gray tree squirrels or common moles or something that is not as emotional a species for you, okay? That will help you quite a bit. And it doesn't matter what's going on in terms of land management or land ownership. If you continue to fragment the landscape like this, biologically and ecologically, the deer population is going to continue to increase because they've got ideal habitat. They can stave off starvation, disease, because they're nutritionally healthy. And a lot of times where we see what's been termed social carrying capacity, or you have deer populations above what the public is willing to tolerate. So number one, we don't have as many hunters on the landscape as we used to have, number one. But if you look at research studies as to why people are no longer hunting, it's two primary reasons that they consistently list. One is, I don't have the time. The other thing is, I don't have a place to hunt, is the other reason that people list as to why they're not hunting. And so there are a lot of focus on especially the impacts to human beings. So property damage from crop damage to agricultural crops, from forced timber damage, deer vehicle collisions, landscape damage, health issues from Lyme disease in particular. So we're losing forest understory. We're losing native vegetation. As you disturb that landscape and you lose that native vegetation, it gives way for invasive non-native species to come in and invade that area so that native populations cannot get hold in there anymore. So with lethal management, especially relative to deer populations and overabundant populations, this is by far the most cost-effective management option. And so overabundance and solving the overabundant deer population, it's an easy solution. Kill more deer. The problem is affecting that solution on more of a landscape scale, okay? So we know that lethal management works, and we know that it's the most cost-effective way to do it, but how do you incent people or put enough harvest pressure in areas where deer are overabundant and you don't currently have enough harvest pressure? Lethal management, again, some of these can be very costly. This is my friend Tony DiNicola up in the far right. He runs a company called White Buffalo, and they are contracted to come into communities where you traditionally or cannot deer hunt, and his company calls deer to reduce the deer population in urban areas. Hiring Tony is very expensive. Sometimes Tony shoots from a deer stand. Sometimes he catches them in a net, and he has to captive bolt gun euthanize them. That gets very expensive. The more you handle deer, the more expensive it gets. Reproductive controls, again, it's a good tool to have in the toolbox for specific situations, but it is not the silver bullet that everybody thought it was when it first started getting researched. So what my co-authors and I are suggesting is to create a commercial deer harvester's license. And so this is very similar to what Dr. Stringham was talking about. I do disagree with Dr. Stringham that we should not privatize the land base, but we do support or agree that privatizing the resource, deer, is something we should think about looking at. And again, as Ryan, when he introduced me, if you look at the European model, if you look at New Zealand and other places around the world, they privatize free-ranging wildlife. And they are able to do it in a way that the population is sustainable, and they can continually sustainably harvest off that population, and it doesn't harm the population. The reason it's so controversial in the United States and Canada is because we've grown up with what's called the North American model. But the North American model is so ingrained in the wildlife management agencies and so ingrained in the hunting public that this is almost sacrilege. And it's to the point where, and I'll tell more about the story, but we have been shunned by our profession in certain venues because of this idea. So, because of our market hunting days, every state in the United States has laws on the books that say you cannot harvest, you cannot kill a free-ranging species of wildlife and sell part or all of that animal for profit. If you're a trapper, you already know that you can trap a fur bearer species and sell that animal's pelt for profit, okay? The reason this is such a controversial statement with deer is because deer are the sacred cow for most wildlife management agencies across the United States. So what we're suggesting is you amend state law to allow the harvest and the sale of part or all of that culled or harvested white-tailed deer within the boundary of where we'd set up a hunt. One is in suburban areas only, in areas where we have historically overabundant deer populations, and multiple attempts have been made with multiple management options using non-lethal, lethal, perhaps reproductive control over years, and those attempts have not been able to drop the population to goal. So what we're suggesting in this paper is that the commercial regulated harvest would occur only after all of the recreational seasons have completed for that particular year, so that we're giving the recreational hunters first chance at it, but ultimately we would still encourage recreational hunting if they can drop the population to goal. If they can't do it, then perhaps start to explore this idea we're talking about now. But the idea is after all the recreational seasons have occurred, deer seasons have occurred, let's go to East Burbia, Jim's favorite town. We're going to go back to East Burbia. They still have an overabundance of deer, okay? So they want to work with the Wildlife Management Agency for the state. So let's say we're in New York. Let's go with the New York DEC. And along with East Burbia officials and the New York DEC, they're going to bound a unit or a portion of East Burbia where they're going to say, within this portion, we are going to sell commercial deer harvesting licenses, and we're going to let anybody who has a license come into that bounded area, and any deer they shoot within that bounded area within the time period we allow, you can sell that deer on the open market, okay? So you can sell it for profit. And then the other idea is because any food source that is for human consumption, especially that you can purchase, it has to be certified and inspected by the United States Department of Agriculture. So you would have to work with a butcher shop that's USDA certified to take that harvested deer. You take it to a USDA certified butcher shop, and then from there, once that butcher shop cuts up your meat for you, you can sell that deer. And you might sell it in any variety of ways. Maybe the butcher shop sells it for you. Maybe there's a middle person out there that you sell it to, and then they distribute it to grocery market chains. But some of the things we've suggested is, number one, anybody who has a commercial deer harvesting license would certainly have to have whatever amount of insurance would be required. So a lot of times, if you go onto other private property and hunt, you're required to have $1 million insurance policy. So maybe it's $1 million insurance policy. But that each hunter would be required to carry and have current an amount of insurance for liability purposes. We don't want any Jack and Jill out there, maybe who just first started hunting. So we're going to have a proficiency requirement. So for example, if you want to apply for a commercial harvest license, you have to come to a range and you have to demonstrate that from 50 yards away, you can hit a bullseye 90% of the time, or whatever the requirement is that individual municipality and the state management agency want to dictate. Number one, because we're hunting in suburban areas and we want people to be safe. But ultimately, the reason we're suggesting this idea, we want to maximize harvest, and we don't want people out there missing deer. Hunter education certainly is going to be a requirement. So you can't shoot the deer and all of a sudden go, oh, geez, now I've got to find some place to process this meat that's USDA certified. You're going to have a previous relationship and a demonstrated relationship with a certified butcher shop or meat processor that you can take that deer to, so you're not wasting the deer, okay? Obviously no wildlife violations, so we don't want poachers, we don't want people who have wildlife violations. We want the cream of the crop of hunters. And finally, there's going to be a lot of reporting, because certainly if this ever does get implemented on the ground, we want to shoot deer, and we want to shoot as many as we can as quickly as we possibly can. One thing is baiting, because we have chronic wasting disease, and we don't want to concentrate deer on a bait pile because it spreads disease, okay? But in this instance, we do want to bait because it's going to bring deer in. And if you talk to Tony DiNicola, he's my friend with White Buffalo, and he's paid to call deer in municipalities, he'll tell you, when I come in to hunt a property or to call deer in the municipality, I don't think about shooting that first deer. I think about shooting the last deer, because the last deer is going to be the hardest to get. And so we want to bring deer into bait piles so we can maximize harvest and try to improve the efficiency of harvest as much as we possibly can. The other thing is spotlighting. Spotlighting is something that we would do at night. And one of the reasons to do it is, number one, it will allow the maximization of harvest. But at the time at night is occurring, it also is when most people are in their house. And so we're reducing the amount of impact to non-hunting public. So Tony uses noise-suppressed firearms, okay? So possibly noise suppression. And it's not only so that you're not alarming the non-hunting public, but it's also so that you're not scaring the deer off that bait pile. And then finally, we would encourage focusing on antlerless harvest, okay? Again, because it's the female deer that you want to put the most pressure on if you want to reduce the population as quickly as you possibly can, because the female deer are the ones that are contributing to the population. You have to hunt smart. The hunter is put in the most strategic spot within that bounded area, okay? So that you can be very smart about how you're hunting the deer as well. So there's a number of benefits of commercial deer harvest. Number one is reduced deer population. One of the things that's going on in suburban areas is there's not enough harvest pressure, and that's why, especially in suburban areas, you have overabundant deer, because you've got unbelievably good habitat, and you have little to non-existent harvest pressure. And so, what we'd like to do is reduce that deer population in those suburban areas by incenting people where they can harvest the deer for profit. We're incenting people to come into those suburban areas and hunt. Revenue generation. And if you look at the amount of money that's generated by deer hunting, there's a huge push for the locavore movement, or farm to table if you want, or whatever you want to think about this, but you cannot get a cleaner source of protein than a free-ranging animal. So there are definitely some concerns about this program here. So one of the big concerns is we're going to go back to those black market hunting days where we overharvest the population, and especially, as I mentioned, deer. Deer is a really interesting species, and it has an unbelievably interesting relationship in that socioeconomic, social status. And so I guarantee you, with the amount of regulation we have in place from state management agencies, the amount of science we have available to us today, and the amount of monitoring that would go on if this ever occurs, we will never, ever overharvest deer, okay? And I think deer have demonstrated that they are a pretty quickly reproducing population, and if you reduce the harvest pressure on them, that they can rebound pretty quickly. Black markets. You're going to have black markets regardless. If you start introducing money, you're going to have black markets. But we have black markets today in trade of wildlife, and wildlife is not a market commodity. I think this is very similar to certified timber, for example. When that log gets cut, that it gets tagged, and that tag follows that log through the entire supply chain until it goes to the consumer. And that's the same thing that would happen with the deer, commercial deer harvest, is that once that deer gets harvested, it would get tagged immediately, no different than you have to do currently for recreational harvest. It would get tagged immediately, and that tag would follow that animal through the entire supply chain until the consumer purchased the animal. And then finally is the administration. A lot of wildlife management agencies say, well, this is going to cost us more money because we're going to have to administer a new program. This isn't rocket science, okay? This is no different than selling me a deer harvest tag last March so I can go out with a bow or a gun and shoot deer this fall. All you're doing now is you're selling a different type of tag, and you've got a few more administrative costs perhaps, because if you accept our model, you might monitor for proficiency. You might have to do some more management and enforcement of that bounded area and things like that. But one of the things that you do is you charge more money for that commercial tag, and you build any additional administrative costs into that tag. And I guarantee you that if people know they can hunt deer for a profit, they are going to be clamoring for that tag. And I think that this even could be a revenue generation model for wildlife management agencies. The other big thing is the North American model of wildlife conservation. This is what we have grown up with in the United States. So when we start talking about the North American model, and you start talking about eroding it or changing it, be prepared for a fight, because this is a very sacred 7 tenets right here. The first two is wildlife are a public trust resource. So you do not, even if you own the private land, you don't own the free-ranging wildlife on that private land. But the other one they really talk about is no commercial use of wildlife. As we've mentioned before, you can trap beaver, otter, raccoon, mink, other fur-bearing species, and you can sell that pelt for a profit. So we're already on a slippery slope here. The precedent has been set that you can harvest an animal and sell it for profit. And I would argue, if you look at the ecology of those fur-bearer species, that they're even more sensitive to overharvest than white-tailed deer are. The other issue is the market approach. Well, how do we sustain markets locally so that we can continually have a market so we can continually run this program? And so we need to think about more of our marketing approach and how we can continually supply the market. The next steps, as some of my co-authors and I see this, is number one, to develop some more commercial deer harvest models. So what we've talked about there, where you let recreational hunters come, apply for a commercial harvest license, they demonstrate proficiency, they meet all the other requirements, they go into that bounded area, they shoot deer, and they sell the deer. That's one model. In some areas, you've got the police department shooting deer. In other areas, you've got the Wildlife Management Agency shooting deer. Other areas, you've got controlled public deer hunt. So there's a bunch of different variations to this model that I think need to be fleshed out a little bit more, and that's something that we'd like to explore a little bit more as we go down the line. So we want to maximize the marketing so that we use as much of each deer as we possibly can.